Hello everyone, it's Margot Metcalf from the IAC group again, and as per previous sessions I'm just ad-libbing for the first little while people log in. I hope you've been enjoying the event and have had a chance to meet some new contacts, whether that be a colleague or a supplier or a presenter. In a few minutes, Rodney Hampel will be taking over and presenting about using big data, which is obviously a very interesting topic at the moment. So without further ado, I will pass it to you, Rod.
Thank you very much, Margot. Am I coming through so far?
All good. Thank you.
Wonderful. Okay. It's one of those things where you're not really sure if you're live on the air or if you're hosting a podcast or if you're on the phone. It's all over the place, really. But I'm really grateful for the opportunity at the moment to be able to be a part of this convention. And I think despite all of the challenges and limitations that have been placed upon us around Australia, the fact that everybody is showing up and willing to be a part of such a forum is really encouraging, and one that I feel really, really fortunate to be a part of. So I'm not going to spend too much time giving the backstory because we don't have a huge amount of time, but permit me just a second. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to jump straight into my presentation, and it has changed a wee bit since its original idea. Originally, the concept of using big data and analytics was sort of being put around to predict and prevent workplace musculoskeletal injuries, because that's as a background as a physio, that was where I've spent a fair bit of time over the last 15 years in sort of applying my trade. But I think that with regards to what's been happening a little more globally and what's been happening, I suppose, around with coronavirus, I've decided to open the aperture up just a little bit more to just be in mind at how we can use big data to be able to learn from coronavirus and also what we've been able to do, and clients of mine, what they've been able to do with some of their data and analytics to prevent the spread of coronavirus even during the last few months. So I thought I'd open the aperture up a little bit more. So without further ado, let's sort of jump in. As I said before, a little bit about me. I'm an on-site physio. I'm a physiotherapist. I've been practicing for 15 years, really specialising in occupational healthcare. I'm a partner at Bodycare Workplace Solutions, as well as several other businesses that operate under the Bodycare banner that focus on both injury prevention, health and wellbeing, mental health, safety consulting, workplace health assessments. And the reason why I got into this business and this industry is because I hated seeing people injured, and I hated only, as a physio, I hated trying and fix them once they were already hurt and broken. My whole approach is, how can I stop things from happening? And so myself, my partners, our whole organisation is geared around being proactive when it comes to preventing injuries and issues from occurring. So, you know, when we take a current look at the workforces around Australia and New Zealand, the three risks that I'm looking at the moment is workers' compensation, which is sort of made up both of a mental and psychological health, mental health issues, stress-related issues, as well as physical musculoskeletal issues. Other risks include the ageing workforce. You know, the workforce in Australia isn't getting younger. Wind the clock back some 30 years, the proportion of people in their 50s and 60s that were working was significantly lower than it is today. And the proportion of people in their 60s and 70s that will be working in 30 years from now is going to be close to double the number of those that are working today. And then, of course, coronavirus and the impact that it's had on workforces around Australia. So before we jump into that, I thought I'd really just take a quick look at big data, because I know that it's such an in vogue term at the moment. I mean, you'd really have to be living under a rock in a cave in Luxembourg to not have heard the term big data and try and understand what it really means. So I think I'm just going to take a minute just to sort of unpack it. Big data really is made up of the 5 V's. And data is essentially, we're talking about information in huge sets that comes in. So we're talking, the 5 V's are big data coming in through volume. So for example, when we talk about the amount of information coming through, the density of this unstructured information, the velocity which is the rate or the speed at which the data is being received and then acted upon. The variety of data. So traditional data is structured and ordered, like a spreadsheet. Whereas today, big data is unstructured and can be made up of everything from text and audio files and video files, sound files, all of which require processing. Now that's your sort of your holy trinity. And then to take the other two elements, or the cousins that I would call them, is your value of your data and the veritas, the truth of the data. So when you take the time to consider, when you plot all of these elements together, then you have an opportunity to understand the true aspect of big data and its many uses. So then how do we apply it, and what role does it apply or in preventing risks, those three risks that we spoke about, to workforces of tomorrow? Well, I thought I'd take a minute to now consider, because we're also mindful of time, how we can prevent risks in workers' comp, prevent risks in an ageing workforce, and prevent risks around the impact of COVID. So, preventing workers' compensation risks. What I thought we'd do is that when it comes to managing big data, I think that, and how it really helps, is we need to consider, in our case, we need to consider the injury and claim history. So if we look at workers' compensation risks in a blue-collar environment, we need to look at how many back injuries have been coming in. And then maybe what kind of wearable tech has been utilised to collect data. So such as, have there people been using, some kind of smartwatch, or have they been using sensors that they wear on their bodies, or certain kind of apparatus like exoskeletons? What kind of staff surveys have been done about people's comfort within the workplace? Does the workplace have good, deep job task analysis? Okay. What kind of pre-employment information is there? When we calculate all of those things together, we can actually create an opportunity to have a better understanding of how to prevent risks. And I'll put it into an example. Manufacturing company that created small widgets that were actually used in truck engines. They were having a significant proportion of their workforce that was sustaining neck and shoulder injuries, but they couldn't actually figure out why. Now, on-site physio had worked for quite some time in sort of reducing a certain number of injuries, but we didn't actually get to the bottom of why these issues were occurring. So by taking an overview and having a look at a cross-section of a whole lot of data as the kind of injuries that were occurring, which were the forearm and elbow injuries and wrist injuries, looking at the severity of those injuries, understanding whether they were inflammatory, understanding whether they were strain and sprain injuries, understanding whether they were hand dominant injuries, understanding then using that information and comparing it to using some wearable technology that was worn. So there was this particular group wore some sensors that were enabled us to have a look at the muscle activity. There was a bit of a conversation from each staff member, understanding with each staff member saying, all right, well, when do you feel at most discomfort when you are working? Is it after 5 minutes, 10 minutes, an hour, 2 hours, a day after a heavy day of shift, or before you start work? Reviewing the job task analysis itself and understanding the inherent risks. So is a particular kind of task, when it came to assembling these widgets, is it done consistently? Is it done often? Is it done semi-often? We're looking at the loads that were being handled, and then comparing as well the information that was being collected by their pre-employment data. So looking at when were people most likely to sustain these injuries? Was it within their first year, their third year, their first 3 months, or after 30 years of working? We put all of that into the melting pot, and we then started analysing and coming up with a better understanding of being able to spit out the right kind of prescribed program that enabled workers to be able to work for the right amount of time. They had the right amount of exercises, or the right kind of task-specific exercises. They felt more engaged because the workforce or their bosses were actually paying attention to some of the challenges they were facing. So their shift schedules and their rosters were changed. And it also meant that the company knew how to specifically target the right kind of people to hire down the track. So as a result, you had a situation which resulted in better work design, fit for purpose team members, a more engaged workforce, a healthier workforce, a workforce that had greater satisfaction, and ultimately a reduction in claims, their cost, and ultimately the impact on workers, on the company's TRIFR. Likewise, when we were looking at an aging workforce, a particular workforce, and it's nothing new here, but this particular workforce had challenges where there are a significant proportion of their workers, I think there was about 25% of their workers were over the age of 60. Now, they weren't getting any younger. So the challenge that the business was facing in this particular situation was they were running out of IP as people were getting older. And as people were getting older, even though mental health issues started to decline, but there was an increase in people getting injured, in people actually being unable to do the job for as long because their bodies were worn and torn. And there was a lack of understanding as to how to upskill the next generation. So through a program that we ran, similar to previously, we looked at the injury and claims data. We looked at the ergonomics of the tasks that were being performed, because obviously human bodies become less flexible to certain positions over years. We looked at their biometric values, such as their heart rate and their weight. We looked at their fatigue. And what we ended up doing was we created some programs for this business that harnessed their IP, of the older generation. We made more roles that were fit for purpose, or we recommended more roles that were fit for purpose, which ultimately resulted in greater career satisfaction and a greater sense of fulfillment for the workforce. Lastly, the area of coronavirus. Now, I've got this picture of a meat factory because one of my clients runs a meat processing shop. There are about 350 people that work on site, and everybody knows that unfortunately the meatworks factories have been heavily affected by coronavirus. So what did they do when they were affected? And they were effectively shut down for 2 weeks, one of these factories, when there was an outbreak. Well, what they ended up implementing was they started putting in place things like temperature testing. They started managing the PPE, so it wasn't just bring your own mask, it was they actually had a proper way of dealing with handing out masks and how often you needed to change masks. They managed to implement contact tracing on site. They managed to implement shift scheduling and roster scheduling. They also did key fob tracing, which meant when people actually arrived on site, they actually were, as they swiped their card through to get into different areas. So what that meant was they were able to, this particular client was able to get a better picture of where their risks were. It enabled them to have better education sessions for their workers on site. It enabled them to have smarter shift rostering. They reduced the size of working groups, which made a significant difference. They increased the number of cleaning schedules that they had in place, and they reduced their shutdown significantly. So the next time there was an outbreak, instead of being closed down for 2 weeks, they were only closed down for 12 hours. And the DHHS was so impressed that they didn't even need to come on site afterwards. So I know that I'm working through this fairly quickly, but what that really does tell me is that whether it's tracking the latest mega trends of manual handling issues across a whole production line, or identifying new areas of risks across a cohort or an age profile of a workforce, or implementing new technology to monitor where and when employees are working, big data-driven analytics and platforms actually help companies make the most of today to future-proof themselves for tomorrow. I hope that that has been somewhat of a better way, an informative talk, and I look forward to hopefully hearing from you in the future.
Thanks, Rod. We will email attendees any resources that you have to share. There's no questions. Oh, there is one little comment, very informative, one of the better presentations. Thanks, Rod.
Oh, thank you. That must be for someone in my team.
So thank you very much for that. Much appreciated. We will provide resources to everyone. And if there's any other questions that come through, we will ask Rod to reply to those and send those through.
Margot, I'm more than happy to make my slides available for you. I'll send them via PDF for them to be distributed to those that want them.
That's fabulous. And there will be a link sent through with all resources added to that. So we've got a couple of minutes now to go back to the timeline and join the next session, which is around EMF monitoring. Thanks, everyone.